I want to cross to Alice Springs and catch up with our regular guest, Jacinta Price, who was the country Liberal Party candidate for the seat of Langlingiari at the federal election, and continues. And congratulations, Jacinta. You've also been appointed to head up the Indigenous Studies branch at the Centre for Independent Studies. That's a good move.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of good work to do ahead. A lot of research, and looking at practical ways to move forward on a lot of issues regarding Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, it's a great move. It means you're going to continue to be a significant voice, especially in Indigenous affairs in this country, and through the Centre for Independent Studies, which focuses on small government, practical ways to deal with issues, rational ways to deal with issues. You and I have spoken before about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution and the so-called voice. And one of your key concerns is that you don't think that this is an important enough discussion to really take up all of our political will and media attention. You'd rather focus on the ground on those issues of violence or lack of education or lack of employment opportunities that are obviously disadvantaging Indigenous people in the here and now.
That is true. There are always, much more sort of critical issues that I think need addressing firsthand. In terms of recognition, this is a long-standing issue that I do believe we can process together as a nation. I think that it is wise that Minister Wyatt has differentiated the two, one being recognition and then the idea of a voice. And I think it's wise to really carefully, not sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to this issue, but carefully and thoughtfully work through it, and ensuring that all Australians go along, coming along for the ride when it comes to this particular issue. The other thing is that 80% of those who identify as Indigenous in some of our bigger populations in areas down in the south and the east coast, 80% of those people who identify as Indigenous have children with those who aren't Indigenous. So, these issues are fast becoming everybody's issues, with regard to all of them.
Well, let's talk about the issue of the voice, though, because there's a lot of silly partisan politics around this at the moment. There are a lot of voices on the left, a lot of people on the left who opposed the voice when it was first raised. They wanted more radical constitutional change, and they wanted a racial non-discrimination clause in the Constitution. They wanted a full-blown treaty, and they disparaged the whole idea of the voice. Now they're championing it, and they're attacking those on the right who oppose it. Well, it actually arose out of conservative thinkers getting together with Indigenous people. So it's the Conservatives who actually put this up as a compromise that would protect the Constitution. So there's all that sort of rank partisan nonsense going on. Let's bring you back to basics. Isn't it obvious that there will always need to be some kind of Indigenous voice to government? If federal government is making laws and running programs in Indigenous affairs, as it has the responsibility to do and always will do, it must have some sort of consultation mechanism with a representative body of Indigenous people. Isn't that just axiomatic?
Well, look, I think there needs to be consultation, most certainly, with Indigenous people, and I also, it concerns me that the possibility of creating yet another bureaucracy, which in some ways I think Indigenous people are flooded with bureaucracy, which I believe is what is in some ways getting in the way for people being heard.
Sorry to interrupt, Jacinta, but I think this is a strong argument, and I think most people would agree with that. But isn't the challenge here rather than dismiss this idea as adding to that mess, maybe embrace it as a way to cut through some of that mess, maybe to get rid of some of the other bureaucracies and some of the other organisations to have a single voice that is formulated in whatever way we end up deciding, and it would be the way for Indigenous Australians to have quality input into exactly those sorts of issues you're talking about: education, health, family violence, employment opportunities. Could this be a way to streamline it?
Well, I guess the problem comes with the fact that there are so many different language groups, so many different families. I still don't know exactly what this structure looks like. So I can't support something that, I don't know what it actually looks like in theory, in practical terms. And the problem, a lot of the problem, I think, with some bureaucracies, with some Indigenous organisations, is quite often there are people who are supposed to be represented by them who feel like they're not represented by them, and a lot of personal issues come into play as well when it comes to Indigenous issues.
Sure.
So some people are most certainly left behind when it comes to decision making, and yeah, I would also like to suggest that, well, why don't we look at some of these organisations that exist and have a look at as to whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they're funded for, so that they can better be set up to service Indigenous people, to be those representatives. I mean, personally, I'd like to strip back bureaucracies. The land councils, I believe, are hugely. They don't. There is no sort of accountability for the way in which they operate, and there is a lot of secrecy and a lot of information that is kept. And a lot of Indigenous people I know feel like they're not being represented through such organisations.
Exactly.
So,
this is kind of my point. Is so many people out there saying, let's not have the voice, we don't need it, or it's going to be a third chamber. But we all know there needs to be consultation. There's been various advisory bodies in the past, both formal and informal, Labor and Liberal. We had the First Nations Congress, which I'm told has fallen apart in the recent months. Rather than dismiss this idea, I would have thought we'd all come back to first principles and say, yes, of course the federal government needs to take advice on Indigenous issues from an Indigenous advisory body. Let's, as you say, maybe get rid of some of the bureaucracy, maybe get rid of some of the organisations. Let's make sure we can have one reasonably functioning representative voice that can cut through some of the nonsense and help the government and Indigenous communities focus on the things that really matter.
Well, it all sounds wonderful, but when it comes to putting it into play, that more than often doesn't necessarily work out that way. And I guess that's where I'm coming from with this. Is that if there's a model that is created that looks like it is workable, and it in fact does work, well then, it'd be a miracle. It'd be fantastic.
But I think where we both agree absolutely is it's only worth doing. It can only be worth doing if it actually helps government and Indigenous agencies and communities focus on those really practical things that you're talking about.
Absolutely, that would have to be the absolute aim, is to create, practical solutions to some of these problems. It's funny that I've, lately been reading that all these voices are coming out saying now that symbolism doesn't work. But, we've been bombarded with attempted acts of symbolism and continuation of symbolism, and yet now suddenly people are going, oh, hang on a second, symbolism isn't working. We need to find practical solutions. And again, I think I'm more of being able to work at grassroots level. If that's what this voice can do, can help support those at grassroots level, then that's certainly what I'm interested in, because I know there are a lot of voices at grassroots level that simply are not being heard.
Jacinta, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Jacinta Price there, who, as I mentioned, was the coalition candidate for the seat of Lingiari at the federal election, but has recently been appointed to head up the Indigenous program at the Centre for Independent Studies. So we'll keep hearing her contributions to the debate, which I think is a very, very good thing.